Welcome to the presentation on project scheduling sponsored by the South Dakota DOT.
My name is Matthew Mueller. I am a construction manager working for Project Solutions Incorporated. My specialties include construction management services, usually for owner or government clients, uh, schedule analysis. Those are really my bag, my kind of favorite things to do. Get pretty nerdy on those sort of things. And schedule analysis leading towards claims and or litigation, delay analysis, things of those nature. I've been in the construction industry since 1997. It's hard to believe that it's been that long since I picked up my first tool bag and started swinging hammers, but that's how long it's been. Here's the agenda for today's presentation. We're going to talk about and define critical path method scheduling. We're going to talk about the different types of specifications that we see in scheduling. We're going to talk about the different types of schedules that you may need to create or submit, and then conclusions. So let's start off with what is scheduling. Scheduling is essentially a collection of meaningful events or activities that are coordinated with logic to work toward a common goal or conclusion. What do we mean by meaningful events? On a construction schedule, we would call them tasks or activities. And those tasks or activities are easy to define, small chunks of activity that we can put a title to and put a duration to and a cost. What does it mean to be for those particular activities to be coordinated? We connect all these activities in a logical manner. The examples that we have here are A must happen before B, B must happen before C, etc. A, B, C, it doesn't matter what you call these things, and it doesn't necessarily have to be A before B or B before C, but the important thing is that we know that there's a logical connection between these particular events, and those logical connections are what we would call predecessors and successors. And then the conclusion is your project completion date or your substantial completion date or your inspection, whatever milestone that you're attempting to reach is what we're calling a conclusion. So the critical path method or CPM schedule is a schedule that is driven by activities that are logically connected. And we go back to this activity A to activity B to activity C to activity D to activity E, or we form a sidewalk, we install the reinforcement for the sidewalk, and then we pour the sidewalk. The critical path is normally defined by the longest path. So what's the longest string of connected activities from the start of the project to the finish of the project? It can also be defined as a critical path can also be defined as the one with the lowest amount of float. So if you have a project that you have been given 30 days to complete, but it's only going to take you 20, you would have 10 days of float in there. And we would say which activities have 10 days of total float before they start delaying the project. And those would be the lowest float critical path activities. Here we have a Gantt chart. It's essentially a bar chart that you might see out on the job site that represents the schedule. And what we have is a start milestone here at the top. And we have these red bars here. And these red bars, as you can see, also have arrows that connect each one of these bars. all the way to a finish. So what we have here is, if you follow the red arrows and the red bars, that would be your critical path. We have also a green path. These activities usually indicate that there's a path of work that needs to be completed, but it's not driving the schedule. So these activities also need to be completed, but they don't influence the finish date. We also have durations here. So we've got durations, we've got titles of activities, which are just indicated as steps between start and finish. We've got red bars and red arrows indicating critical path to final completion or finish. And we've got green bars that indicate other activities that also need to be completed, other tasks that need to be completed. As the schedule progresses, what you'll start seeing is you'll start seeing these bars being filled in with blue. And as they get filled in, that indicates progress. So you can expect to see these out on the job site or in the prime's job trailer as they're working through a project. What exactly are activities? And there's also good activities and bad activities. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But activities are defined by the title. What the title basically describes what the task is. The duration, how long is it going to take? Cost and or resource loading can also define an activity, because let's say you only have X number of dollars to complete a particular task. And constraints, which we don't like to see. Typically we only see constraints on milestones, so you'll have a must finish by or must start by dates that constrain particular activities. And as discussed before, green activities typically mean that they're not progress and not critical path. Blue activities means that they've started and progress is being reported on them. Red activities typically are going to be critical path. And that's just using the standard layout in like P6 or P3. I think Microsoft Project does the same sort of design on their activities. But the one thing you got to take away from this is that all activities are bound to other activities, and we call that binding logic. Okay, so now let's talk very specifically about what logic is. So activities are connected logically via predecessors and successors. A predecessor is essentially an activity that is driving the start of the next activity. So in an A goes to B goes to C scenario, A is the predecessor to B, B is the predecessor to C. Successors are what must start after an activity is finished. So in that same ABC scenario, B is a successor to A and C is a successor to B. The typical relationships that you see are going to be start to start. So that would be like activity A starts and activity B can also start to finish. So activity A starts and that would connect to activity B finish. So then you would actually have a flip of B coming before A. It's almost like the successor-predecessor relationship has changed, but it drives the schedule a little bit differently. Finish to finish, you see that quite frequently too, especially on summary level activities. So in a finish to finish, activity A finishes and activity B should also be able to finish. But the most common that you're going to see is finish to start. So Activity A finishes, activity B then starts. But it's logic that determines the start of every activity. We don't use constraints. Constraints aren't typically allowed. And we're going to go through that in the specification discussion. But we typically don't like to see a schedule that's been driven by forced dates. So we don't want to specifically say on May 1st, we're going to start forming, and then on May 3rd, we're going to do reinforcement, and on May 5th, we're going to pour. What we want to see is on May 1st, we're planning on starting forming, and it's a 2-day activity. And what comes after that is reinforcement, and that also takes 2 days. And then what comes after that is we're going to pour, and that takes 1 day. We don't want to see the dates specifically called out or have these activities constrained by dates. There's a couple little tricks that you can use to manipulate logic to try to shrink or expand a schedule using lags or leads. Lags, we see those all the time. It's totally an acceptable practice to use lags. And what that essentially says is activity A is going to finish, and then 3 days later, activity B is going to start. So you can put a 3-day chunk of time in there. This is handy, like let's say you finish a concrete pour, and 28 days later you're going to have your final test break. Okay, it's totally acceptable to use that in practice using lags. Leads, on the other hand, which are considered to be negative lags, not a desirable way to manipulate a schedule. So leads would be negative lag. So you're saying activity A is going to finish, but I want activity B to start 3 days before activity A finishes. There's certain scenarios where that might be acceptable, but the problem there lies in your kind of depending on a perfect scenario there where activity A is going to finish exactly when it was supposed to finish, and activity B is going to start exactly when it was supposed to start. It relies too much on what I say here, a theoretical future. We don't know what's going to happen 3 days after activity B starts in that scenario. We can hope that activity A is going to finish, but we don't really know. So typically when I'm reviewing a schedule, if I see negative lags, it's an automatic rejection. So what we want to do with logic is we want to use logic to coordinate our trades and our resources, access to areas, and we use the logic to sequence out the activities so that we can plan the whole project. So here we're just using roughing in some electrical per floor as a convenient way to look at this. So we're going to rough in the electrical on the first floor, and then we're going to rough in the electrical on the second floor, and then we're going to rough the electrical in on the third floor. That's pretty straightforward. In this particular case, you're working with one crew, and that one crew is going from one floor to the next after they completed the floor before. You can use logic to coordinate resources in any number of ways, not just the electrician or just a single trade. You can use logic to coordinate multiple trades. Here's a good example. So we've roughed in the electrical on the first floor. So because electrical has been roughed in and it's been inspected, now we can start putting sheetrock up. But before we were roughing in electrical on the first floor, we need to be framed out. So we need framing, and then we need electric rough in, and then we need sheetrock, and then we need tape, and then we need paint. So you can use the logic to coordinate multiple trades and multiple steps. Just for some vocabulary here, some things that you're going to hear out on the job site when talking about schedule. The data date. So the data date is the date that was chosen to determine the drop date, dead date for reporting progress. And we use this mostly for pay requests and processing pay requests and things of that nature. But what it does is it sets the same day for every month so that you have a consistent point to measure from. This is helpful when you're doing an analysis of a schedule so you can compare the previous month's progress to this month's progress and what can we expect for the next month. In this example, we use the 20th of every month. I typically like to use the 1st of every month because every month has a first. Not every month has a 31st. Total float. The plain definition is the number of days available before the activity must be completed in order to avoid delaying the project. So total float, you'll hear contractors talk about that all the time, especially when they're talking about activities that are not critical. So critical activities typically have zero float or zero total float. And activities that have float means there's a window of opportunity to get this particular activity done before it impacts downstream activities. Now, just because you have float or your particular activity has float doesn't mean that there is no sense of urgency to get it complete, because there are still activities that need to be finished after your particular activity is done. And if you are absorbing that total float, then you're making it so it's not available to other activities that are downstream. If you are indicating a negative number on your total float, that means that that is already delaying the project. The activity is critical and it's impacting the project completion date. So negative total float activities are activities you especially want to pay attention to. Work breakdown structure, or WBS. A work breakdown structure is just a handy way of breaking the project into smaller chunks so it's a little bit easier to navigate the schedule. Typically, what I like to do when building a schedule is I'll start with the work breakdown structure first, and I'll just break the job up into smaller chunks. And then I will, from there, build activities inside each individual work breakdown structure. It's just something handy. It's just a little tool that's inside most of the software programs. And you might hear about it on the job site. Cost loading. Cost loading is the dollar value that's been assigned to every single activity. So what we like to see is cost loaded activities. So, getting back to the frame, rough electrical install, sheetrock, for the framing activity, you might have a cost in there of, say, just play with me here a little bit. Let's just say $100 for framing. Okay, so when that framing activity starts and then completes, you would have brought $100 of value to the project or to the schedule. Then we've got electrical, and let's say the electrical rough-in costs $1,000, and the activity starts on the 29th of April, but is still not complete by the 1st of May. But let's just pretend that it's 30% complete. So when we go through that billing cycle, the electrician would be paid or compensated, or the prime would be compensated for 30% of the overall value of that particular activity. So in that case, if it's a $1,000 activity and it's 30% complete, we're talking $300. Well, all those percent completes and actual starts and actual finishes and the cost loading, that ends up getting put into the schedule of values, and that schedule of values is what we end up using for pay requests to determine how much to pay for the month or whatever the billing cycle is. Resource loading is a handy feature, and it can get very complicated. Cost is actually considered a resource when you're cost loading a schedule. It falls under the resource loading category. And you can resource load all sorts of things into a schedule to make the schedule work better for you, between labor or equipment or materials. And it helps to not only to coordinate resources, but also to make sure that you have the amount of resource that you, whichever type of resource that you need to complete the project. It can help you with forecasting, kind of let you know, oh, I need that mini excavator out on the job site to complete 3 activities, and all 3 of those activities are going at the same time. So really what I need is 3 mini excavators, but I only have 1. And so if you only have 1, then you know that you need to stretch those resources out or those activities out a little bit, and you can see how that might impact your schedule. Baseline schedule. Baseline schedule is the original plan that everybody has somewhat agreed to. That ends up being the measuring stick that's used throughout a project. That's just it. It shows that there is a plan that goes from the start of the project to the finished project. Update schedule is essentially that plan that we've determined in the baseline in progress. So every billing cycle or every schedule cycle, we will update the baseline schedule, and that'll be turned into what is called an update schedule. And we can see how the schedule's been impacted. As-built schedule is the plan completed. So these are the actual start and the actual finish dates of every single activity that we planned. And that just goes into the project record so that everybody knows what happened and when. Here is something that you will hear from schedulers all the time. Garbage in equals garbage out. It's all in the details. So a schedule is only as good as the level of detail that is provided and the quality of the connections between the activities. Many of us have seen schedules that are just lip service to fulfill the requirements of a specification. It's not there to actually be used as a tool. The whole point of schedules and schedule development is to build tools that are useful to everybody on the job so they know where they have to be, when they need to be there, and what they're going to need when they get there. And also lets them know when they need to be finished in order to not delay the project. So having a very high resolution on your activities is very important. Having a full understanding of the intricacies between logical connections of particular activities, not just your specific activities, but how those logic ties connect with other activities that might be with another trade or even another contract. So in order to kind of set a standard, these are a list of some of the industry standards that we have for construction. So maximum duration of work activities is 15 days. And that's essentially 3 weeks. Anything more than 15 days, it needs to be broken down into more detail. All activities need a predecessor and successor. No open-ended logic. So all activities have to have something that connects to when it's supposed to start, and they have to connect to something that follows up. So it could be project start connects to landscaping, and landscaping connects to project completion. There would be continuity there. It's true. There's no open ends on either side of that landscaping activity. All activities should logically connect to a start milestone and a project complete milestone. So, when I was talking about work breakdown structures, usually I break the job set into multiple smaller chunks that are a little bit easier to work with. Well, as soon as I get done with that work breakdown structure, the first thing I do is NTP and project completion milestones. And I set those dates. What is our projected NTP and what is our must complete by date? All activities should connect somehow to start and finish. It might be a very convoluted route in between the two, but there needs to be some continuity there. How do we determine activities? So when you're putting your bid together, you should have a pretty good understanding of what your trade's production rate is, what you're expected to do, and how much stuff you got to do. So we're going to want to know what's the material, what's the labor estimate, what is the production rates for the particular labor that is going to be installing the material, and having old projects to look at and prior experience determining that give you some sort of track record to look at to help you determine what those sorts of activities, how much time those sorts of activities take is very helpful. So if you have that information, you should be able to determine your original duration, or OD as we'll call it. And your OD should always be the amount of time it'll actually take to perform the activity with a given set of parameters, whether it being cost, material, labor, whatever the constraint is there, whatever the deciding factor is on the duration. It needs to be exactly what you think it's going to take. If it's going to be a one-day activity, we need to call it out as a one-day activity, not a 5-day activity, because we'd like a window to make sure that we have the crew available and the weather is going to be good, and whatever other contingencies that you might build into a particular schedule activity to kind of reduce your risk. Those sort of things need to be taken care of with another topic that we're going to talk about, which is calendars, not your original duration. If you are building your activities with a contingency amount of time in them, or making your activities longer than they're supposed to be, you could get hit with sequestering float, and that's never a good thing. So let's talk about good activities versus bad activities. So activities need to do a really good job of describing the work that needs to be performed. It needs to do a good job of spelling exactly what task needs to start and finish. It's helpful if we have locations, but the activity bar on most schedules is pretty small. So you want to just be concise, to the point. If you have a whole bunch of stuff that needs to take place, or a whole bunch of letters that you need to use to describe the activity, maybe you should consider breaking that activity up into some smaller components. Activities need to be one step at a time. So I will use FRP over and over and over again. So we form, and then we reinforce, and then we pour. Or we do framing, we do rough electrical, we do sheetrock, we do paint, we do electrical trim, and then we do electrical inspection. Activities need to associate with a single responsible party. So my favorite one that we see all the time is MEP install. So mechanical, electrical, plumbing install. Typically that's 3 trades. It could even be 4 or 5 trades. We need to break those activities down into individual trades. So we need a mechanical install, and maybe that's a sheet metal, and maybe that's a pipe fitter, and maybe that's a equipment installer. So that would be three separate activities for mechanical, electrical, and plumbing. That would be, I mean, up to 5. And really, you could even go with steam fitters, or plumbing could be any number of folks. In electrical, you could have, is it just somebody pulling some signal wire? That could be one type of electrician, or is it installing some high voltage duct banks? That could be another electrician. A whole different trade set, a whole different contractor, and that's a good way to kind of look at this is trades and contractors, subcontracted. You don't want to have two subcontractors responsible for the same activity. Always keep in mind the garbage in, garbage out scenario. So we want to be as concise and as detailed as we feel is necessary to not just check the blocks of the specification, but also to help us build a good tool. Here's some bad activity examples. These are, I've already kind of gone through these. So form, rebar, pour. Should be 3 or more activities. Each portion could suffer an independent delay. So, if you're saying forming is going to take you 1 day, rebar is going to take you 1 day, and pour is going to take 1 day, and you say, okay, well, it's a 3-day activity. Well, what if forming takes you 4 days, or the rebar doesn't show up, and so it's a couple of weeks, but form's been done forever. And when you're going through your as-built schedule and you try to figure out where did all this delay come from, and you have an FRP activity, you don't really know what component of that 3-part activity was the cause of the issue without going through a whole bunch of paperwork. Frame. Just frame as an activity. I mean, that's very vague. We need to describe the work. Like, what are we framing? Where are we framing? What kind of framing is it? Is this a 30-day activity? Is this a 1-day activity? Frame is just too vague. We need more detail. Install MEP, we already talked about this. This could be many, many trades. So we need that broken down to 3 separate activities at a minimum. Here's some examples of good activities. Install foundation forms. Install foundation rebar. Pour foundation concrete. I mean, that does a good job of describing the task. It breaks down FRP into 3 separate activities, just like what we're looking for. Frame exterior walls. Frame first floor walls. First floor interior walls. I'm sorry. We've taken frame and we've given it a little bit more detail, a little bit more meat. It does a better job of describing the work that is supposed to be done. Rough and electrical, section line A1 through B1, rough and first floor plumbing, rough and mezzanine ductwork. This is MEP broken down into more detail, more specific, one trade at a time. Let's talk a little bit about calendars and using calendars and why they're important. Essentially, the key takeaway here is activities are completed. Not all activities are the same. Concrete cures 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? So we would want concrete cure calendar to be, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So if we have an event that needs to take place after concrete is cured, we're not sitting there scratching our heads trying to think of, well, how many hours is that? It's because we've got an 8-hour, 5-day-a-week calendar, and they poured on a Saturday. What's 28 days later? Usually it's 20, but it's not worth trying to sit there and scratch your head and figure it out when you just build a calendar that says all hours are work days. Some other thing that you might come across is some trades might work 4/10s, some will work 4/8s. We need to make sure that we're getting our calendars kind of sorted out so that if a contractor that is working, 4/10s versus 5/8s, and they say they have a 5-day activity, that's 4 days one week and 1 day the next week. It's not all going to be finished in the same week. So we need to make sure that we're aware of that. We're making those adjustments to our schedule. This presentation is 4 DBEs through North Dakota Department of Transportation. You'll be working for the Department of Transportation, and they take all the regular government holidays or bank holidays. So we want to make sure that we have all those into a special owner calendar, so we're not scheduling inspections and things when there's not going to be an inspector available. Weather calendar. Very important to have a weather calendar. So working for the DOT, we'll be doing a lot of work it's North Dakota, so winter probably isn't the best for outside weather conditions. We need to take weather into account when building our schedule and have a good understanding of how it's going to impact our activities. So what we do is we build a weather calendar, and that weather calendar essentially says these are the number of days that we can plan on being shut down from doing any sort of outside work in a given month. So you can use weather data from weather.gov or NOAA and kind of figure out what are going to be the factors that you need to take into consideration for whatever type of work that you're going to be doing that could be outside and affected by weather, and come up with a typical month. I basically take the averages from the last 10 years and say that will give me the number of days for the month, and then I will scatter those days randomly throughout the calendars, month to month, and it'll say in that any sort of activities that I have that are going to be outside activities, I use the outside activity calendar for, and then it automatically impacts my schedule. Now, if you don't use those weather days, then you should just be gaining days on your schedule instead of having a whole bunch of weather impacts that you hadn't planned for. So we have to plan for weather delays in our schedules. Total float, we already kind of talked about this, but we're just going to touch on it briefly here real quick. But it is the maximum amount of time an activity can be delayed from its early start without delaying the entire project and without violating a schedule constraint. So typically a critical path, we have a total float of 0. That's what we like to see. And it's calculated by taking the late start date minus the early start date, or we take the late finish date from the early, or the early finish date from the late finish date, and that will give us this number. Where does the float go? So it's important to note that, and contractors will argue that the float is theirs, and owners will argue that the float is theirs. It doesn't belong to anybody. The float belongs to the project. It's a resource that's available for everybody who's involved with the project to use, and it's in everybody's best interest to not use it if you don't have to. But where does it go? So if we're manipulating calendars, like weather calendars, let's say we've already built up our project and we found we forgot to incorporate a bunch of weather delays, and so we change our calendar to show the potential weather impacts, and there goes all the float. And it's because we've turned those days that were supposed to be productive into not productive days, and that's what ate up all the float. We will lose total float if activities don't start or they don't finish on time. So if you finish an activity and the preceding activity doesn't start immediately following that, you're losing float. Or if you say it's going to take you 5 days to do a particular task and it takes you 10 days, you just ate 5 days of float. So float's going to be scattered amongst the activities. It's just in your best interest to do your best to not use it. Every day counts and impacts the longest path. So this is important, especially when you have trades or contractors, subcontractors that look at the schedule and they say, oh, I have 10 days of float. I got 2 weeks before I have to get that done. Well, if they don't get that activity done for 2 weeks and it impacts all the preceding activities, and then one of those other activities is delayed for one reason or another, and that becomes the new longest path, and that becomes the critical path, then it could potentially fall back on the contractor who said, oh, I have 2 weeks before I need to finish this, and they could be held responsible for liquidated damages. Every day counts. Keep that in mind. Cost loading, schedule of values. So we talked briefly about this before. So the schedule of values is it's a big spreadsheet, and it has all the activities and the cost for each one of those activities. So the schedule of values should correspond to the total contract value. If you go through all the activities, you total them all up, it should equal total contract value. Different projects are going to have different requirements and schedule of values. A lot of times there's different pots of money that a lot of things need to come from. So how that's coded and how it's broke down all just kind of depends on the project. Benefits of a good schedule of values: it makes it so easy to do your end of month billing, because you sit there and you say, okay, this activity started, this activity finished, this activity is only 50% complete, and automatically figures out your pay app for you. And which, making it easy makes reviews shorter and typically means you get paid sooner. Risk management. When we're building our schedules, these are just some tips to keep track of or to consider when you're building them. Make sure you're using the right calendar. When you're doing your monthly update, make sure you're keeping accurate track of accurate dates. So be very specific on when an activity started and when it finished. Make sure that your schedule has high enough resolution to adequately track delays and delay impacts. So, getting back to less than 15 days per activity, make sure that we have well-defined activities. Make sure all responsible parties agree to the baseline schedule prior to its execution. So you build the baseline schedule that defines the plan that you're going to be moving forward with. Make sure everybody who has an activity in there that they're responsible for agrees to and understands and knows that these are the dates when they need to be there and need to be able to finish and complete their tasks in the given amount of time. And last, use the schedule to be proactive, make corrections before they become issues. So we do our updates on a regular basis. If we start seeing problems, we need to make those corrections right away. Real quick, I'm going to talk about schedule specs. So the schedule spec is always in Division 1. It's typically section 013216. It provides, quote unquote requirements. Typically, the spec doesn't do a great job of covering the intent of the schedule, and that's why a lot of times you'll see contractors that are just working a schedule up to fulfill the requirements of the specs, not to be used as a tool. As a construction manager on the owner's side, I review a lot of schedules, and by reviewing those schedules, I've kind of come up with a little bit, there's some wiggle room inside the specification. So a lot of times you don't see what software is called out. P6 is the go-to. It's definitely the best. Use P6 if you can. It's not that expensive. I think it's like $550. especially if you kind of know what you're doing and you don't need to pay for all the Oracle support. P3 is also good, but good luck finding it nowadays. And as a reviewer, I can't even get a license for it anymore, so I can't even accept a P3 schedule. Microsoft Project kind of seems like that's what I get most of the time. Microsoft Project is definitely not the best. It kind of works. The update function on it barely works. And I feel like with the Microsoft Project schedule, I'm getting mostly constraint-driven schedules. Excel, 100% not acceptable. That's not a CPM schedule. That's just checking a bunch of blocks. As far as resource loading goes, 100% of activities need to be cost loaded, and 0 exceptions unless it's like a summary level activity or something like that. That's what we're going to be using for billing. That's what we're going to be using for cost curves and all these other things. So cost loading has to get done. Resource loading, as far as equipment, labor, materials, I will let that one slide unless it's absolutely necessary, like if there's a sort of critical concrete shortage or something of that nature. Normally, a spec will say you have to submit 3 copies or however many copies of the schedule on paper printed out. That's kind of a waste of time. I don't even deal with hard copies. Everything I work with is digital. So I scratched that one off the spec as soon as I get it. PDF is fine. There's a bunch of different layouts that might be called out. The important ones that we're going to want to see in PDF are the overall schedule, the update schedule, like what happened in the last month, and critical path. Those are the PDFs that I typically look for when reviewing a package from a contractor. Submittal activities, I only require submittal activities in the schedule if it's going to be a critical path item. You know, long lead activities for critical path work, definitely got to get those in there. Submittals connect to long lead, so I want to make sure that we're keeping track of those things that we think might impact the project completion date. Some things that you will see missing from specs that I think really need to be included. Original durations not to exceed 15 days. See that all the time. Just missing from the spec. That really needs to be in there. Weather calendar requirements. It's really nice if your spec calls out the number of anticipated weather days for every month and what the standard is for a weather delay day. Holiday, no work calendars. Yeah, I mean, they don't ever call that out in this schedule. You just need to kind of figure that out on your own. The use of leads and lags, a lot of specs won't call that out, but that should be in there. So we only use lags, we don't use leads. Requirements as far as what closeout activities are required. Coding requirements, that's just coding a schedule is really nice for being able to sort and pull out very specific information. You don't typically see that in specifications because it's kind of a nice to have, but and it really gets kind of down into the nerdy bits of scheduling, but it's definitely nice and recommended best practice. Owner responsible activities. So the owner is going to have specific activities that they are going to be responsible for, as far as like inspections and acceptance and walkthroughs and things of that nature. You don't usually see those spelled out really clear inside the specification, and it would be very nice to have those. So I add those in my notes when I'm reviewing a baseline that you need to add the following owner responsible activities. So what's a preliminary schedule? Prelim schedule, you'll typically see that just right after NTP, and it's just a 30-day schedule. It's going to connect this from NTP to when we get our baseline schedule figured out and accepted. So normally we'll see it as it gives you a 30-day window. The preliminary schedule just connects between NTP and baseline. It can mirror the proposal schedule, but just keep in mind that a prelim schedule doesn't have to meet or match the proposal schedule. Your client or owner is going to want it to, because that's what they awarded the contract based on. But it doesn't necessarily have to. Baseline schedule. So this is the schedule that the entire project will be measured against. It demonstrates that the contractor has a plan or an intent to complete the project on time. It shows zero float, shows all the steps from NTP all the way through project completion. And we got to make sure when we're building the baseline schedule, we're keeping in mind that whole garbage in, garbage out scenario. And we're not just there to check the block on the spec, but we're there to actually build a tool that we can use to plan the work downstream, and use the schedule as a tool for forecasting, etc. The look ahead schedule. So we always talk about the look aheads in our progress meetings. It's just a really short-term schedule. The spec will call out if it needs to be a 2, 3, or 4-week schedule. It discusses in between the update schedules, work that is actually taking place, what's going to go, who's going to be on site doing what next week. You usually see this schedule is generated by the site superintendent, and ideally it's generated straight from the most recent update or baseline schedule. But a lot of times you just see it, it'll just come as like an Excel spreadsheet. But the important thing is the look ahead schedule needs to line up with the plan. If it's not lining up, especially on critical path items, you need to understand why, and the owner may ask very specifically why. Update schedule. Okay, I've talked about this, but we pick a date and we measure the project baseline based on that date at the same time every month, or whatever the cycle is. So the update schedule is basically the baseline plan being executed and in progress. This is where you might hear the revised data date issue. So we're just into May, so right now I'm reviewing May 1st update data date schedules. You also hear the update schedule considered or called the live schedule. And when we're doing our update schedules, we're updating the baseline plan, but we can also use the update schedule to kind of figure out ways to manipulate logic to still achieve the goals of the project. But maybe if we need to recover from some sort of delay, we're going to use the update schedule to kind of figure that out and do time impact analysis and things of that nature. But why do we do an update? Why don't we just run the baseline and that's it? Well, we use the update schedule primarily to track project progress and see where the project is on a specific data date. We can also use it to review actual performance versus baseline versus each individual update. So we could be checking things like actual starts and finish dates versus the baseline's planned start and finish dates. We can check our actual starts and actual finishes before what was the plan in the previous update. We can check our actual durations versus our baseline original durations. And we can look for stuff like out of sequence activities, and those will point out specifically logic issues and where was our logic incorrect and how are we working with that, or do we need to maybe make a few changes to the schedule. Update schedules, we can look at change orders and we can incorporate change orders. We can see how are they going to impact stuff downstream. we're going to address and mitigate delays by changing things like logic, or what if we can throw some more labor at this particular activity so it has a shorter original duration. And the update schedule ties directly to the schedule of values, so it gets us to our invoicing and progress payments. So keeping in mind schedule updates again, it's as of the data date. So we don't talk about anything that happens after the data date. Everything that happens after the data date is just what is the plan moving forward. But as of the data date, the update schedule contains as-built schedule information. It contains current information on activities that are going on, and it contains the plan for what's left on the project or the remaining activities. The contractor provides a narrative that kind of describes the update, and it describes the current status of the project. It describes any sort of deviations that we might have from the original plan or baseline schedule, and any changes that we've made to the plan downstream to mitigate any sort of delays. Schedule values shows actual earnings to date. It will also, with each and every update, kind of show you what was billed for that month or that payment period. So, in conclusion, scheduling isn't magic. We just build this database of activities and tie logic to them, and the software uses the critical path method to get us from point A to point B. The important bit, garbage in is the same as garbage out. So we're here to build a schedule that we can use as a tool. We're not just there to try to check the block to meet our contractual obligations. It's always important to keep in mind that the schedule is a project record document, as well as it can be an effective tool in planning. And always keep in mind that professional in cooperation with your prime or your subcontractors will get you a really long way on schedule. For more information, especially on CPM scheduling softwares, YouTube is your friend. You can find just about everything that you're going to need to know just by doing a quick search for P6 on YouTube. I've included some sources for some suggested reading if you really want to get into the nerdy bits of scheduling. And the Construction Management Association of America, CMAA, is also a great resource, cmaanet.org.
If you have any questions on project scheduling or the South Dakota DBE program, please contact dbe@projectsolutionsinc.com or call 605-737-0377. Thank you.